sports, you are living contrastive grammar, we are going into the hospitals. Our next two presentations will be focusing on healthcare, and we will have one on interpreting in healthcare, and the second one is on translation in healthcare. So our next presenter is Joseph Knights, and secondary traumatization for healthcare interpreters. Let's welcome Joe.
Cue yes here.
Say again?
Just got to cue you up.
Okay. Cool. See it, right? Okay.
There it is.
All right, wonderful. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Joe Knights, and I'm here to have a brief discussion about coping strategies to avoid secondary traumatization for healthcare interpreters. And I'm focusing the target population on refugees because, again, refugees have a tendency to be more traumatized than the general public. Is this one here?
I didn't see the other one.
Oh, it's the other one. That one?
Try it on two. Which one moves it? There it goes. Yeah. That one.
Right,
Just
great.
did.
All right, very good. All right, now, what we want to do is focus again on healthcare interpreter trauma and trauma. There's loads of information that I was able to find with regards to coping strategies for caregivers. And when I mean caregivers, I'm talking about doctors, social workers, nurses, certified nursing assistants. But there wasn't anything that I could find with regards to healthcare interpreters, with regards to dealing with secondary traumatization, which is what we want to focus on here. Now, again, as I said earlier, secondary traumatization it exists in many different domains: caregivers, case managers, and social workers, especially social workers who work with traumatized individuals, especially refugees. Now, the one paper that I did find with regards to dealing with traumatization, secondary traumatization for healthcare interpreters, only mentioned a couple of lines about vicarious traumatization, and also post-traumatic stress disorder was mentioned, but there weren't any solutions with regards to dealing with secondary traumatization for healthcare interpreters. So, here's a brief definition of what secondary traumatization is. It talks about the trauma-related symptoms to exposure to detailed and graphic accounts of traumatic events. And these traumatic events include isolation, extreme moodiness, intermittent sleep patterns, and loneliness and anxiety. Now, another synonym for secondary traumatization is compassion fatigue. Okay? Now, we're going to get real basic. What does a healthcare interpreter do? I think we all know that in this room. Healthcare interpreters facilitate interlingual communication between the patient and caregiver. And from Dr. Formanic's class last semester, we learned from Dr. Beltran-Avery that the 4 ways that healthcare interpreters behave are advocates, conduits, cultural brokers, and they perform using the incremental intervention model. Now, from Dr. Zhu's class, we learned that the conduit role is not necessarily preferred among healthcare interpreters. We learned that from a couple of different scholars. I think it was Dr. Tsai and Dr. Dysart-Gale wrote extensively about healthcare interpreter role and how healthcare interpreters really don't like the conduit role. Now, again, the target population for the people we want to work with are refugees. And who are refugees? We want to provide a brief definition for them. And a refugee is an individual that faces some well-founded fear of persecution from race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. Now, again, this is about trauma, so we want to describe a couple of different types of trauma that most refugees face: imprisonment, witnessing horrific acts of violence, humiliation, physical abuse, sexual assault, and torture. Now, why is this research important? Why did I decide to take on this task? Because again, there wasn't a whole lot of research with regards to, actually really any research with regards to dealing with the secondary traumatization effects for healthcare interpreters. First, interpreters face constant exposure from trauma, from hearing about graphic descriptions of traumatic events. So, if you're a healthcare interpreter and you're dealing with a traumatic situation, you not only have to hear what the traumatized person says in that source language, but then you have to interpret what that traumatizing situation is in the target language. Now, as this applies to refugees who are also serving as interpreters, this risk increases when that interpreter belongs to that particular linguistic community, and it also, or shares similar cultural values to the person that's been traumatized. And in many instances, when you're dealing with refugee resettlement agencies, many of these agencies typically rely on a concept that Dr. Fermanik and Dr. Zhu talked about, ad hoc interpreters. So you're basically dealing with really untrained interpreters, people who just happen to know the language, but they're not necessarily trained in the art and, quite frankly, the science of interpreting. And let's face it, I mean, if you're here in Winston-Salem, you're going to have a very difficult time finding professionally trained interpreters from where most refugees are coming from into the United States. So you're not going to find a professionally trained Amharic interpreter or a Tigrinya interpreter or frankly an interpreter that speaks any of the Burmese languages, whether it's Kachin, Karen, or Burmese. It's going to be very difficult to find a professionally trained interpreter. So in most cases, or in almost all cases, they're ad hoc interpreters. Now, if untreated, vicarious traumatization or post-traumatic stress disorder can occur. Now, there is a trauma continuum that I want to briefly discuss. And part of the reason why we want to talk about secondary traumatization is because it's the lowest form of traumatization and it's the most easily treatable. So if we attack secondary traumatization first, we don't have to worry about vicarious or post-traumatic stress disorder. And again, no research exists for this particular topic. Why do we want to deal with this? Because ultimately we want to make sure that we help. We want to make sure that people get the help that they need. We want to make sure that the healthcare interpreters get as much care as possible, especially since they're helping people that don't understand the language. Now, again, remember this, we talked about people sharing refugees being from the same background as the people they're interpreting for. Now, I want to provide a brief discussion of the Affordable Care Act and why we want to talk about refugees getting access to care and how this relates to interpreters dealing with their trauma. Affordable Care Act was signed into law by previous President Barack Obama on that exact date, March 23, 2010, became into law. Now, the Affordable Care Act, quite frankly, is used as what's called a three-legged stool approach. And the three legs of the stool are access to insurance, which is what the main mandate of the Affordable Care Act would involve, the individual mandate, which basically says, hey, you have to buy health insurance, and government subsidies, which somehow make the Affordable Care Act and premiums more affordable. Now, what we want to focus now on is this middle column. Now, refugees, asylum seekers, and other humanitarian immigrants are eligible to receive the three different types of government-sponsored health care. The Affordable Care Act subsidies, Medicaid, and CHIP. CHIP is an acronym which stands for the Children's Health Insurance Program. Now, you can also see that there's different types of refugees, asylum seekers, and other humanitarian immigrants. Some of these other humanitarian immigrants include victims of torture, human trafficking victims, special immigration visa holders, typically from Afghanistan and Pakistan, and people who receive what's called parole. And typically those are Cuban and Haitian people that are allowed to come into the country without any questions being asked. Now, the Medicaid expansion, North Carolina was one of the states that did not accept the Medicaid expansion. So as a result, getting benefits, healthcare benefits, is a bit more difficult in North Carolina than some of the states that did accept the Medicaid expansion. Now, and again, here's a graphic showing the coverage gap. I know we're short on time, so I won't go into a lengthy explanation with regards to this. Many refugees receive only 8 months of health care. Trauma affects the mind and requires specialized care, and in most cases, not only specialized care, but long-term care. And this care is usually not covered under health insurance policies, or it's too expensive for refugees to afford. So I had 3 different conversations with 3 different people who belong to the interpreting community. One of them is a Spanish and English interpreter from the United States, and she's a healthcare interpreter, and obviously she speaks Spanish. And she acknowledges that her job is stressful, and her facility or her hospital doesn't have any coping strategies or any formalized treatment plans to deal with workplace stress. Okay? Now, part of her personal coping strategy is sharing the emotional burdens with her coworkers. And when I spoke to this person, I asked her, hey, how would you deal with all this? And she said, look, without her team, she wouldn't be able to cope with difficult interpreting events. She likes sharing the burden with other people. I also spoke to another healthcare interpreter who is Mexican born, and naturally she speaks Spanish and English, and works in another healthcare facility in North Carolina. Now, her situation is interesting because she was once a patient who needed an interpreter to facilitate communication from Spanish to English. So she understands both sides of the continuum. And again, similar to the first interpreter, her workplace doesn't have any real support to deal with workplace stress or deal with trauma, dealing with secondary traumatization. Now, part of this interpreter strategy involved going for walks, yoga, and meditation. And what this interpreter enjoyed doing is leaving her work at work. Sometimes she would take her shoes off and go inside the house, or she would take a jacket off and leave it inside, or take a jacket off and leave it, not bring it in with her, because she needed a physical reminder to not bring work into the home. Now, I also spoke to a case manager. This gentleman spoke Portuguese and several other African languages. Some of them I can't even remember. And again, he was a former refugee, and he works for a resettlement agency in North Carolina. And this gentleman doesn't interpret anymore because he actually has a new job with the resettlement agency. And we had a very lengthy conversation, and during our conversation, he told me that the emotions, when he used to interpret, the emotions were very, very difficult because hearing someone else's difficult story reminded him of his story. And he never really looked for treatment because he, quite frankly, didn't know how. He just tried to block out the emotion when he was interpreting and tried to focus as much on delivering the meaning and communication rather than getting wrapped up in the emotions of the interpreting event. And this was a direct quote. He said, "Joe, when I interpreted, I had to be strong, not only for me, but for the people I was helping." Now, some of the shared characteristics among these three people were developing a thick skin. All the interpreters had a certain amount of emotional toughness that was necessary for healthcare workers. They all valued benevolence and gratitude, and they wanted to cultivate this particular level of trust and rapport. And they focused on positivity and helping others. Now, what are some solutions? Now, again, there wasn't any research that I could find directly that related to interpreters. So much of the research that I had to do was dealing with other domains that had similar characteristics to what would work for healthcare, etc. One is mindful meditation. Meditation seems to work. Now, there are several of these neurological connections that take place with mindful meditation. Again, mindful meditation creates new neurological connections in the brain and focuses on self-regulation, which is very important because, again, there was no team support or no formalized support for any of the interpreters that I spoke with. And mindful meditation reduces stress, reduces anxiety, increases spirituality, and then also improves self-coping strategies. Now, part of these neurological connections, I know Dr. Fermanik, in your class, you mentioned that interpreting involves creating new neural connections, and several of these neural connections are somewhat similar to the neural connections that are related to mindful meditation. We also want to manage emotions. Now, in Dr. Zhu's class, we talked about emotional labor. Okay, and emotional labor is the process of emotional management to meet job requirements. Now, what we want to do is make sure that employees are expected to regulate their emotions throughout their job. Now, again, having these sorts of different roles and the confusions among the roles makes emotional labor management rather difficult because you don't know if you want to be a cultural broker, you don't know when the time would be to be an advocate, etc. Now, in health communication, we want to use the NURSE method, and this is from our health communication class that actually none of you are in, except me.
And Caroline.
Yes, and Carolina, yeah, she's not here, unfortunately. She's at her internship. First, what we want to do is name the emotion. We want to understand the emotion that we're dealing with and respect our emotions, support yourself and others. Find someone that can help you if you're not able to help yourself. And explore your feelings. Find out why you feel the certain way you do, and then figure out a way to deal with the feelings the best way you know how. Now, another solution is self-awareness and self-care. You got to realize that we're stronger than we realize. We're all strong individuals. And interpreters must be aware of the need to protect themselves. You got to know when you're in a difficult situation, you have to understand and say, hey, you know what? I actually need help. I need to take a look at what I'm doing and really reevaluate my situation. An interpreter should adopt an active coping style, essentially to make sure that we're taking steps to avoid the harmful byproducts of stress. Now, this fourth concept is sensory or environmental alteration. And I had two of the interpreters I spoke with actually mentioned a similar concept to this. One said that if she smells, for example, the smell of dried blood, what she'll do is she'll use aromatherapy to eliminate that smell so it doesn't create a triggering event that could create a traumatizing situation. Another interpreter also discussed seeing a blood splatter pattern. That's a difficult one to say. Blood splatter pattern. And if this interpreter sees a blood splatter pattern, what this interpreter will do is look at lines or a checkerboard to eliminate that imagery from the mind so they don't create a triggering event that could create a traumatizing situation. So, in closing, ultimately what I wanted to do with this project is to make sure that everybody gets the help they need, not only interpreters, but the populations that they're serving. And empathy and sympathy are important values for caregivers and healthcare interpreters, as I'm sure we all understand. And we also understand that there's a special bond that healthcare interpreters and patients share, and quite possibly it's a matter of life and death if we're not doing our jobs to our best of our ability. I know Dr. Rosenberg, during several of our chats, you talked about several of the families that you interpreted for and how there was a certain closeness that you felt with them. And language, as we all understand, creates roots and forges alliances and trust. And hopefully what we wanted to do, again, is to contribute to healthcare interpreting by allow healthcare interpreters to come up with coping strategies to reduce and eliminate secondary traumatization. Because again, our greatest resource is us, okay? We're here to make sure that we help each other, okay? And I especially want to thank Dr. Barber and Dr. Rosenberg for all their help. I know this was not a very easy project for me to finish up because, again, there wasn't a whole lot of research about this topic. Any questions, everybody?
Questions or comments for Joe?
Anyone? Yes, sir.
So you mentioned Phil John Avery and his model. With everything that you've talked about and the effects it can have and how to prevent these problems, do you agree with the conduit model? Do you agree with the conduit model?
No, I don't necessarily agree with it because I think it's easy to just become emotionless and just go ahead and just focus on communicating. But I think, as we all understand, healthcare interpreting is not as easy as just being, as I know Cy and Dicer Gale, and I know Dr. Vermonic, you mentioned this, it's being this voice box. You can't just be a voice box when you're dealing with healthcare interpreting. I think there has to be some level of nuance that's involved with regards to being a healthcare interpreter. I think it would be strange if you were just a voice box and didn't have any sort of emotion and feeling or empathy and sympathy while performing this particular job. So just being in that conduit role, I don't think it would necessarily be the best way to go about the job.
Follow-up question, sorry.
Of course.
But do you not think by then getting slightly more attached to the situation, that would then exacerbate these issues of emotional fatigue?
See, and therein lies the problem. Because again, if you don't show emotion, you end up bottling up that emotion, and then you could potentially lash out. If you take on the emotion, and this is something I wanted to mention, but again, there's only so many slides we have. One of the interpreters that I spoke to said that she deals with the emotion and doesn't try to fight the emotion of a traumatic situation. She usually allows the situation to take place, and then she deals with the problem afterwards, rather than trying to push away the emotion and potentially bottling it up to have a much worse situation take place later on down the line.
And also, I think that, when you work as a staff interpreter in a medical facility, interpreters actually have much more contact with the same people on a regular basis than the rest of the medical staff do, because you're only working with a subset of the patient population that's monolingual in another language, right? So you see the same families over and over and over again. They get to know you, they recognize you, and oftentimes you live in the same community with those people, like what my experience was. is I would see those people if I went to church with my wife. They would be at the church. I go to the grocery store with my wife. I'd see the same families that I interpreted for in the clinic, and their kids would run up to me or whatever. And so it became, it's harder to distance yourself the more that you start dealing with the same people all the time, and they get to know you, you know them, and you establish that
Build a
relationship.
relationship.
And then when
of
terrible
course.
things happen to them, then it does affect you more personally,
Right.
you know.
So I have a question. So
Yes, ma'am.
you are basing your conclusions or some of those recommendations just on some conversations, open-ended conversations with 3 interpreters. I think that could be a starting point, but there's actually a wealth of research on refugee interpreting in the last 2 years in Europe. In the UK we have Tipton, we have in Austria, we have several things coming up in Germany very recently. And I would like to see if you have any connection or if you have read any research on that, because this is all just coming on some anecdotal interviews which could be supporting some
Okay.
other statements, but compassion, fatigue and other things have been pretty well researched, especially in the UK, in the social care and violence. And so have you had a chance to look at those studies?
I looked at a lot of different literature, Dr. Vermonic, and again, like I was saying earlier, there was plenty of research with regards to compassion fatigue, and even with regards to asylum seekers, there was plenty of research with regards to dealing with traumatization for those people who interpret for those populations. But again, I didn't see anything specifically for healthcare interpreters. I didn't see anything out there. And again, there were entire journals about caregivers, how doctors deal with stress, how nurses deal with stress. There are entire journals specifically about that particular topic. But again, I didn't see anything for healthcare interpreters.
Wouldn't think it would be a better approach to kind of borrow some of those methods rather than just basing on some kind of random methods that people apply, and we don't know how they.
You gotta say that again. I didn't hear you.
Yeah. So wouldn't you think that it would be better to maybe support your statements with some of those methods, maybe, or approaches from other fields, like transferring, methods that they have tested in other fields that are related to social care or dealing with patients, rather than basing some recommendations just on a couple of personal experiences?
Well, that's
because it's not really well structured as far as your
most of the
interviews.
most of the research that I did, in addition to the interviews, the solutions that I was coming up with came from some of those other domains where those sort of treatment strategies seem to work.
Just we didn't see where they came
Yeah,
from.
yeah.
It wasn't
I
no reference.
didn't exactly make that clear, but yeah, that's because again, I didn't want to just go ahead and interview 3 people and then just say, oh, well, hey, I've interviewed 3 people. This must be the solution. I don't want to make it seem like that my presentation was that, but the solutions that I came up with, given the interviews that I did and looking at existing research, I tried to put those 2 together to come up with some reasonable conclusions and reasonable solutions to come up with something that could help healthcare refugees. deal
So
with
I think
trauma.
it would be helpful to actually make some references or list those other.
Okay.
Connect them.
All right.
All right. Anything else? Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you.